Welcome, everyone. Hello. My name is Qasem, and today I'm going to be talking about the Vsphere API. There's a few of them. I'm going to focus on two. I've only got 35 minutes, which is not enough time to talk about APIs in details, so I'm going to have to rattle through the older API quite quickly. I'm sorry you're going to have to keep up, but I'm going to save a bit more time to teach you a few tricks about the newer, more sexy REST API. Quick question. Who codes in the room? Who's a coder? Chris, you can't go out. You are or you're not? Put your hand up if you're a coder. All right, put your hand up if you're not a coder. Why's my brother not put his hand up? Right, I know you can code, right? So guys, put your hands up again, you're not a coder. Right, those who don't know me, keep your hands up. The rest, okay? So the ones that put their hands down, have I taught you nothing over the last 5 years? Nothing at all. Jesus. Right. Now, that question will make a bit of sense in a minute. Once I can actually get my laptop going. Should we go do not disturb? Yeah. Sorry about that. Oh, we got sound as well. Oh, Jesus Christ. Thank God. Right, now we can start. I'll rattle through this quite quickly. For the guys who don't know me, I know a lot of guys already. We're a big community. We've been doing this a long time. But this is me. I work for a company called Atos. This is not about Atos today, or anything to do with Atos. I'm a community speaker. I have a few blogs. One's quite old. It's been around for about 13 years now. One of the things that I kind of mastered a very long time ago was how to interrupt and program against the Vsphere API, specifically the previous older, hate using the word older, SOAP-based API. If that sounds very confusing, don't worry, it'll all make sense in a minute. Yes, I'm the best DJ ever in the world, by the way. My brother will collaborate my story. So, disclaimer, you're going to learn a few things that could be dangerous today, right? If you fuck up your system, it's not my fault, okay? It's as simple as that. Yeah, it's your own problem. By the way, I'm not a programmer. Well, not a very good one anyway, right? And you'll see that in a short while. And I'm sorry, I've got to rattle through the first few slides. Guys, who's done anything with the VMware vSphere APIs or attempted to? Oh, there's a few people, right? Who's actually hit the SOAP-based API? Oh, you see, that's a different story, isn't it? Okay, I'll put my hand up because I have. There's a journey here, and the journey starts with a very old API called the COM API. And you don't see it anymore, but it was VMware's first way of allowing you to automate the ESX server through a very antiquated API. And they moved on, actually, when vSphere or vCenter came around with a web services-based API called the SOAP API. SOAP stands for Service Oriented Architecture Protocol. And since then, we've got different ways to interrupt and work with and talk to and integrate with VMware and vSphere through PowerCLI, which is not an API, by the way, but it's a way to integrate with vSphere. And we have an orchestration engine. And more recently, well, a year ago or so, VMware finally, after all this time, brought to us a REST-based API. Okay, and that's the focus of this session. I've got to do a bit of history first, and then I'm going to show you the REST-based API and how to work with it, because it's 10 times simpler than the older versions of the APIs. So why do you do this? Why are you interested in the API? Someone tell me. It's a question. And I'm giving you a clue. It's about automating shit, isn't it? Right, yeah, at the end of the day. By the way, I ran this session like 7 years ago. Barry is in the audience. Sorry, Barry, I've got to call you out. Barry was in that session. He's there at the front. And that whole session was about the SOAP-based API. And I did this whole pitch on how to use and how to integrate and interface with the SOAP-based API. And Barry, at the end of that session, came to me and went, Ricky, all you've done is convince me I'm going to learn Power CLI, and I'm not even going to try and program against that API because it's too complicated. I want you to remember that point, right? Please remember that point I've just said. But why we're here today and why we're interested in APIs is so we can interface with Vsphere, with VMware, so we can automate it. We might want to do that through scripts. We might want to do that through our own programs and code. Or we might want to do that through an ITSM product like ServiceNow or Remedy. Who uses those products? Yeah, a few people. Cool. Should be interesting for you. So I've wrote a few apps. I'm not a developer, but I've wrote a few apps, a few tools. And some of it was out of necessity. So my first ever application to interface with VMware was called VP Snapper. And what VP Snapper was a tool that I used to automate what's the word I'm looking for? Renewal of a snapshot in a training environment, because I needed a way to automate multiple snapshots being renewed, right? Being restored. Back then, there wasn't a way to do it, so I wrote a tool to do it based on one of the APIs. And every time I wrote an application, a little tool that someone might find useful, it was out of necessity. Someone asked me to create a resource pool scheduler because they needed a way to juggle resource pools. Now, that particular feature is antiquated because it was added in the native VMware scheduling technology. And it goes on and on and on. And the last application that I wrote, the last tool, is an application that allows you to, and I love this animation. Wow. You see that? Wow. Who uses VRA? Hands up. Not many people. So there's a tool called VRA from VMware, vRealize Automation, and there's this horrible little Lego icon, and it's done my head in for years. And I needed a way to get rid of that icon. I needed a way for me to be able to upload my own icons into VRA. And I wrote a tool to do that, right? It's just out of necessity. It's a way of automating something. It's a way of doing something without, you having to buy into a third-party tool or ask someone else to do it. So the SOAP-based API, if you ever want to get into this, but this presentation is not about that. The SOAP-based API, it's been around for 10 years. It's the main API that people integrate with when they're talking to Vsphere. When you're using an application like a backup tool like Rubrik or Veeam, or a monitoring tool like Wheeler or VM Turbo or something like that, they are communicating with Vsphere through this API, the older API. If you ever want to get into working with this specific API, a good book to read is this one from Steve Jin. He gives you millions of examples of how to do different things. It's like a cookbook for the API, right? Yeah. It's all in Java, unfortunately, but if you're a C# developer, like I was originally, then you can actually understand the code because Java and C# are very similar. Anyone programming Java or C#? Oh, Chris, you can't go like this, buddy. It's got to be this or not. Right, so this is important. This is going to give you a bit of a hand up. Behind the scenes, right, when we're talking to Vsphere and we're trying to automate it and we're trying to do things with the things inside Vsphere, there's a whole data model that's laid out inside vCenter. And the data model consists of the objects and parameters that make up Vsphere. And it's things like virtual machines, or properties about a CD image, or a network, or a host machine, or a data center, or a cluster. And it's laid out in a hierarchical tree. And this is what the tree looks like, right? So when you interrupt and you communicate using the API to Vsphere, you're actually communicating, or you're pulling back information about objects that are in this tree and that are about Vsphere. Any questions? I'm going through quick. The cluster resource itself, so it's, you know, when you look in your data center and you see under the hierarchical tree within vSphere, you see data center then cluster, it's that object. I'll tell you what, we'll do this offline because I can't remember, it was 5 years ago, right? Yeah. However, I will go through it with you. I'm happy to do that. By the way, because I'm speeding through the SOAP-based API, if anyone wants to go into it in detail, come and see me. I'll talk you through it, no problem, right? Guys, one tip. You'll see this in a minute, hopefully. There's a lot of data, an awful lot of data. So I've wrote a tool that's not in that list because I never finished it to pull back every single object and parameter out of the Vsphere API. And it's something ridiculous like 600,000 objects, right? And it ranges from everything like, you know, how much memory, shares, resources, CD-ROM, everything about virtual machines, how they're related to networks, how they're related to data stores, you name it, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of objects. The concept of integrating with vSphere or communicating with vSphere over an API is not to pull back everything, and it's to use filters and actually pull back what you need. And I use this term, you know, go after the low-hanging fruit. If you're just after virtual machines or a specific part of the virtual machines, you are able to filter back everything, right, yeah, and only pull back the information that you need. That's true for the older SOAP-based API and also true for the REST-based API as well. Anyone seen this before? Come on, guys, you must have. Managed Object Browser. Put your hands up if you've seen it before. What is it? Anyone? It's a plugin manager. Well, you can manage plugins with it, but it's not a plugin manager. What? It's a way into the API. It lists all the objects, but not just the objects, but all the methods and actions and stuff you can do with the objects, right, within the API. If you're ever trying to debug and work out how to use the SOAP-based API, this is a very, very handy tool because it lays out all the classes, all the methods, all the properties, and you can maneuver through your tree, right, through your inventory to work out how to integrate to certain parts of the API. How have you used this, though? Anyone? Yeah, debug stuff, right, yeah, because, what? Yeah, fix plugins, yeah, true. When you've got to remove a plugin, how do you do it, right, yeah, if it's like orphaned, I don't, you know. By the way, I have a tool for that. No, I do. I have a tool for that. I'll skip through this very quickly. The way to interface with the older API was you created these filters, like I said, and the way to do it was specify the type of property, the type of thing you want, and where to start from. You remember that hierarchical tree, right, yeah? You don't have to go from top to bottom. You can start in a specific point in the tree, and that's what the traversal spec is. What's a managed object reference? Everyone should know this, if you're a vSphere admin. Go on, it's not a trick question, I promise. I won't try to trip anyone up much. Anyone know? Chris? It's like an identifier for the bloody object, isn't it? Every object in the vSphere API, in the hierarchical tree, VM, data store, host, network, cluster, resource pool, they have this identifier called a managed object reference. And that's the key thing. That's how you identify your virtual machine when you're talking through the API. Keep going. I'm going to skip that. I'll skip this. Right, let's talk about the REST API. Fairly new, about a year old. By the way, it's not as feature-rich as the SOAP API yet. So those 600,000 parameters and objects, don't expect to get that out of the REST-based API, but there's a very, very, very valid reason for that. What VMware have tried to do is remove the complexity. They've had this opportunity to start with a blank canvas, and they said, we're going to build this API, this REST-based API, and we're going to do it in a way that's simplistic and easy for people to use, right? The SOAP-based API was not simplistic and easy for people to use. So, I'll skip that. How are we doing for time? Yeah, I'll come back to this one. I've got another slide on that. So, now I'm into trainer mode. I'm going to teach you a few things. Who's so far attempted to talk to the REST-based API successfully? Yeah? All right, it's one or two. Good, good, good. So for those who are interested in doing that and not done that yet, have you used Postman before? Heard of it? Yeah, one or two people have. Oh, okay. So Postman started life as a Chrome extension. Postman is a REST client. It's a way of producing REST calls without breaking out into code, without programming something. It's an interface that allows you to communicate to a REST-based API and do stuff, right? To work with the Vsphere REST API, it's got a bit of security built into it. So the first thing that you've got to do is send your username and password. So your user has to have permissions at the root level of your tree, yeah, to the Vsphere API, which then gives you a session token. You see that? So after you've got your session token back within Postman, you can start to do stuff, right? Any questions so far? I rushed through the SOAP bit, but now I'm conscious that I've actually got a bit more time to use. Any questions? So this session token comes back in the form of JSON. And you can start to do things at that point once you have the session token. JSON, if you want to learn a bit more about JSON, there's a whole website about it. Learn the DOM, document object model. Basically, in a nutshell, it's a way of storing data in key pairs. It's very simplistic. Once you've got the session ID within Postman, you can start to do things like I keep saying. The first thing that you might want to do when you're dabbling with this is list all the virtual machines that you've got in your environment. You send a command through Postman to the REST-based API with your session ID. You see the URL at the top? You see that? That's the URL, the endpoint for listing all the virtual machines in your environment. The payload that you get back is the list of virtual machines with some parameters, some. Now, in the older SOAP-based API, you'd expect to get thousands and thousands. I think just for the virtual machine part, it was like 6,000 different parameters and objects. Now, VMware, what I do away with that and just provide you enough to manage your environment. And that's the whole basis of the REST-based API. So, question? No? Okay, keep going. So, we noticed something here. Here's our managed object reference. This is the unique identifier for this object. This is a virtual machine running on my system. Every object in that tree, remember that tree? Hosts, data stores, networks, VMs, resource pools, clusters, right, yeah? They all have this managed object reference, and that's how you reference that object. You don't reference the object by its name that you give it, Ricky's Windows 2007 server. No, you reference it using this managed object reference. And every object has a unique reference per virtual center. Okay? So, there's not 6,000 parameters there though, is there? So how do I find out more about that virtual machine? The answer is if you've got the MoRef, you can do shit. You've got the power of Grayskull. And, what? Retro, yeah. So, if I've got the MoRef, I can actually query an endpoint with the MoRef. You see the MoRef there. And I can find out stuff about the power state, but I can also do stuff to it. You see that? What am I doing there? I'm asking the API to start that virtual machine, right? From code. I've got a clicker here and I didn't even use it. So, 6,000 objects. Where is it? Where's those parameters? Well, if you actually want more detail about the virtual machine, there's an endpoint for that as well, right? So if you specify the moref of the virtual machine, and just that moref, yeah, you'll get a list in JSON again with more information about that specific virtual machine. It's not 6,000 objects or parameters, but it's enough to get you going, right? It tells you about the virtual machine. You can do stuff to it. You know what its CD-ROM is, what network it's connected to, right? It means you can start to think about automating stuff. Is this making sense now? Cool. Now, there is a slight difference, in my opinion, between the older SOAP-based API and the REST-based API. Well, what you got when you actually requested a list of objects, for example, maybe about virtual machines, in that list of objects, in the older SOAP-based API, you actually got reference to its child and parent objects as well. So a virtual machine belongs to a host. Do you agree? Right, yeah. A virtual machine could be inside a folder or a resource pool in Vsphere. Do you agree? Right, and in the older SOAP-based API, when you actually queried for a specific virtual machine, you could find out its parent and child objects as well, for example. You don't get that right now in the REST-based API. That's not there today. However, there is ways around it. We know that connection is still the same, right? Because if you do something like filter based on the moref of a host, yeah, you can then list out the child objects of that specific host, like virtual machines. So that connection behind the scene, and that's why it was important for you to see the hierarchy of how the data model was laid out in these different folders. That connection's still there behind the scenes. It hasn't changed. You just don't get as much information. Any questions? Okay, should we keep going? Now, you've seen this. One or two people. What do you think of it? I'll come back to the guys who've not seen it in a minute. I think it's quite cool. So VMware, with the REST-based API, and not just in Vsphere, but some of their other tools as well, have added an open source API documenting tool called Swagger. They've taken the word Swagger away, but it's still Swagger behind the scenes. What Swagger allows you to do is reference how you use the API. But in addition to that, it allows you to try out on your live environment the REST queries. So it's a very, very quick and easy way to learn how to make these REST calls, right? You start from the beginning, you work down, and it shows you exactly what to do, how to do it. You see the string command line here, right, yeah? So it tells you the different properties to put in Postman if you're using Postman to check your, to query your REST-based API, and the endpoint URL. It'll tell you everything that you need to do to actually make that REST-based command or query. And you get to try it out live, so you can see exactly how it works. It teaches you how to use the REST-based API and documents it at the same time. Cool, eh? So again, good point. I thought I had a slide for that. It's a very good point. Okay, very easy. Barry asked the question, how'd you get to this? If you just go to a browser and instead of going to your vCenter server stroke web client, yeah, and you just go to the URL of your vCenter server, the domain name of your vCenter server, you get this page at the front which says, do you want to install the HTML client? And do you want to install the web client? You seen that? Yeah. Well, right at the bottom on the right-hand side, it says API Explorer. You hit that, and you're there. All you have to do is log in, and off you go. Cool or what? I mean, it's a major time saver. It really is, because it means you don't have to try and debug it yourself and work it out for yourself, how to make these REST calls. Okay, so my microphone keeps going loud. Huh? It's just me. Yeah, so once you've got that moref, guys, you can do other things like understand or mount the ISO image from the content library. By the way, just as a quick reference, the content library API it's actually not part of the vCenter, same API, but it's all accessible from the same point. It's just in a slightly different location. But you can do things, so you can mount an ISO image in the content library if you want. Ricky, you cheat. Then I ask you if you code. I put my hand up, didn't I? Well, if you use Postman, again, who uses Postman? Have you used the code feature? No one ever noticed that? You see that? It says code. And do you know what it does? Can anyone guess? It generates the code for you in different languages, right? It generates the code in different languages to make that REST call, right? So if you're a Node.js developer, it'll show you an example of the REST query you've just made in Postman. If you're a C# developer, the same, JavaScript, da-da-da-da. Cool or what, eh? That's nice. Oh, God, you know I've got the worst memory in the world, Rob, right? Yeah. There's about 10 in there. You know what, though? There's a bit more than 10, because it's not just the languages, but it's like it also details different frameworks as well. So, for example, JavaScript, I think in there was like jQuery, Ajax, and what's the other one? XFR or whatever, right? Yeah? Yeah, so it's a bit more than 10. Ricky, you cheat. There you go. And that's how you get going, using the REST-based API. You need to learn to code. You need to learn to use the REST-based API. The tools are there. It's very simple. And you can cheat if you want to. So, God, that was very quick. So yeah, I skimmed through that. Should we go back to the SOAP-based API now? I think we should. Spend a bit more time on that, because I skimmed through it very quickly. All right, let's go back. Say again. I touched it once. Yeah. It's not something. I tried to make a client once with the remote desktop, the remote console bit in it, but no one does that anymore. There might be someone who needs to. There are many, many other APIs, by the way. My brother's making a point here. There are other APIs out there. There's also APIs for storage as well, right? Yeah, and virtual disks and all sorts. But it was a long time ago, by the way. I still got the code if you want it. Do you mean the Vim? You mean the SDK one? No. Yeah, I know which one you mean. Yeah, I don't know. I've not touched it for a long time, and I'm talking 2010. Well, we mean you can do that offline. You're my brother, right? Yeah. SOAP-based API. Here's a way to cheat. .NET developers again. Hands up. Oh God, just you, Chris. It's you every time, isn't it? Right. So, way to cheat. This is how I did it. The old SOAP-based API is a web services API, and VMware give you very detailed instructions on how to actually create an SDK, a wrapper, so you can actually communicate with that older API. And yes, you just follow some instructions and you end up with either a Java wrapper or .NET wrapper. But if you want to cheat, do you remember the 32-bit Vsphere client? Yeah, anyone still use that? No, everyone's moved to the web client? Or we're still using the 32-bit client? A little bit. But be honest, come on. I do, occasionally. I've still got some 6 servers, 6x servers. Well, if you look in the folder of where your 32-bit client is installed, you'll find 2 DLLs. If you include those DLLs into your projects, your .NET projects, for example, you're halfway there, because this is the SDK. This is the wrapper for actually enabling you to talk to that SOAP-based API.